Very pleased that you're here with us today. And my name is Dr. Kleinfelter. I'm the chair of the business program. I'd like to introduce her dissertation committee to you and then explain a little bit about how this works. Dr. Wright is her dissertation chair. Good morning. And Dr. Agard Jones is her other committee member. We're very grateful to them, and Cassandra as well. The way this works is Cassandra's going to go and explain her study to you. The two committee members will be the only ones allowed to ask her questions. And then when they're done, we will take off to another room and discuss things, and then we'll come back. Okay? So with that, you're up.
Okay, thanks again for everyone coming. I know many of you have traveled a distance. And this is a Skype session going on here for family members and friends who are out of state and could not get here. And Sheila Rostami is one of my former students helping out in this process so that it could be as interactive and live as possible. But I can't look at my cousins grinning at me. Okay, so one of the reasons that I was so pleased to be able to find this particular program that I'm in the doctorate program for business is because they allowed me to stretch as well as to find my niche. And my area of interest has always been leadership capacity and development, but I could not initially find a graduate program that allowed me to strengthen my business skills while at the same time concentrating on the leadership element. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I talk about the school quite a bit, because it allows you to do a few more things than typically you're allowed to do. You're allowed to tailor some of your program. So with that, my area of interest is I'm doing a blending. I'm looking at charter schools, and I'm looking at charter schools from a business perspective, because charter schools are business. Most of them are multi-million-dollar operations, and they are accountable to the public as well as to the community. So I'm looking at that in a combination of sorts. Okay. So here's my table of contents. We're going to go through a little bit of overview, literature review, research methodology, then give you the results of the study, and then a bit of discussion and recommendations for the field community, academic community. So why study leadership? This quote comes from Hunter and Linsky. This is a team that comes out of Harvard. Leadership is worth the risk because the goals extend beyond material gain or personal achievement. By making the lives of people around you better, leadership provides meaning in life, it creates purpose. And what we'll talk about quite a bit as we go through and look at the environment, the working environment in which the executive charter school leaders work within, this is critical piece right here. Risk and how to develop a methodology for making decisions that mitigate some of the risks, and certainly meaning and purpose. So from Hodgins and Linsky, they talk about distinguishing between adaptive leadership and technical challenges. So adaptive leadership is very clear because you have to be quite a bit flexible and adapt to situational changes. And then the technical aspect of leadership is what you know, the current knowledge that you have. So that comes with expertise, authorities. And then adaptability is placing it where the problem is, where the people are, and giving them resources and support, and being able to move throughout crises and manage that. Okay, so the purpose of this research was to examine the relationship between professional training and leadership practices among executive charter schools. And my area of concentration and where I'm looking at is exclusively Washington, D.C. So what are charter schools? This is how they are defined. They are publicly funded. They are, as I said, they're nonprofit organizations, which means that they can apply for funding through grants or private institutions. They are self-governed. LEA means Lead Educational Agency, and a lead educational agency is very much synonymous to a local school district. They function like a business with entrepreneurial expectations, and they are authorized either by a local school district, a governing board, a state education department. They also, applicants that apply for charter schools to run, they must meet state requirements, meaning, I guess there's quite a bit of conversation now about core competency, so they must meet those state requirements. They are also known by thematic academic programs, whether it's leadership or arts, technology. They all have some specific theme that identifies them and separates them from competition. They're given much more freedom in terms of creating these programs and developing their curriculum, but they also have an extremely high accountability, because if they do not raise student achievement level from year to year, they come into a great deal of review, very public review. Okay, so the context is leadership capacity has become an interest nationally as well as locally, and so here are some of the challenges in terms of what's being discussed in conversation about charter school leaders and executive leadership there. There's few charter schools nationally, and this comes out of the National Association of Charter Schools. There are a few charter schools nationally that have an executable succession plan, meaning if one of the baby boomers that started the school decides to retire, there's no real plan to replace that person. And as I'm saying here, there's been quite a bit of survey and questioning these baby boomers who have started the charter schools going back 20 plus years. 60% of them are reporting that they're going to retire by 2013. So you pair that with very few outlets for training for executive charter school leaders, and there's a perfect storm possible in development. So more charter schools are opening every year, and then the lack of a national standard is also an interesting part of the discussion in the debate of executive charter school leadership, because what New York views as a good standard for executive charter school leaders, having business acumen, governance, and such all down the line, is quite different from how DC here looks at charter school standards. So there's no national standard, and that's one of the things that nationals are trying to kind of coalesce and bring about. I'm going to show you a couple slides here that for a reason, because charter schools are so diverse that they are beginning to morph into more of a business modality, because they are very unique and they're also appealing to specific niche audiences. So that's the key for businesses when they're able to offer a specific service or product to a specific audience and do it better than their competition. This is what charter schools are able to offer. So these next couple of slides show you real diversity in regard to what charter schools offer. This is an all-boys school in Chicago, urban center. This is a suburban school in Delaware, where they're trying to offer opportunities and enhance and support more girls going into math and science programs. And then this is a school in Hawaii that concentrates on environmental and eco-friendly education and learning. So very, very diverse around the country. Historical foundation, charter school started in '91 in Minnesota. State of California followed with a charter school legislation the same year, and then the following year, 19 states signed charter school legislation. Currently, there are 42 states that have charter school legislation. As I said, the 20th anniversary was 2 years ago, and there were 500 schools. Nationally, there are 6,000 plus and 2 million plus. And also, this is a very interesting piece here, because there are currently 1 million students across the country that are on waiting lists to get into charter schools. And that's quite a bit of leverage and bargaining for executive charter school leaders. Now, here's the Washington, D.C. profile. 10 schools opened in '99, 102 charter school campuses are in operation today. However, there are only 57 organizations because there are multiple campuses. 9 are former Catholic schools, which is a very unusual and not typical way in which a charter school forms. Typically, a charter school form, if it's a conversion, it comes by way of a public school conversion into a charter school. Now, this happened during 2008, during the economic crisis. So it was either the Catholic schools that have to close their door or come up with an innovative way of surviving. So currently, there are 32,000 students in DC charter schools, which accounts for a 92% growth rate, and DC has 22,000 on the waiting list. Charter schools currently represent 44% of the enrollment for school-age children, which is also burning children. The table is that DC nationally has ranked #2 over the past 4 years in terms of local market share for charter schools in comparison to the percentage of students in public schools. And so everyone across the nation in the industry is really looking at New Orleans, DC, and Detroit. I'm sure you heard a little bit about Detroit, and they're going bankrupt, or they say they're going bankrupt in receivership. But they're looking at now what is going to happen with school reform, because 41% of their schools are charter and they're going into bankruptcy. So that'll be interesting. But keep your eye on DC here for a second. Okay, so this is the charter school environment in which a charter school executive works within. So here you have the internal environment, staff, parents, students, alumni. Board members I put outside because they're not in the environment on a daily basis. Now, so this comprises of a whole host of individuals, agencies, and people. So, and then here's your authorizing agency, which gives the authority for a charter school to open. It is also the compliance mechanism that holds a charter executive and the board accountable for running the agency in the manner that it's supposed to be fit. Now, you have to follow me here for a bit. In order for, and this agency is called the DC Charter School Board. In order for someone to sit on this board, they have to be recommended by the United States Department of Education, the Secretary for the United States Department of Education, right? And then the person or persons are appointed by the mayor in order to sit on this board to regulate and speak to governance here at the school. So you also have an agency called the DC Office of State Superintendent, and then you have City Council, who make decisions about annual charter school budgets, and you have City Council members who are now introducing legislation that will impact charter school operation. So you have a lot of interplay here that affects this, and also sometimes interacts here with the charter school associations, and sometimes in order to get what they want out into the public, they go here. And so all of these pieces is what the executive charter school must be able to manage effectively and efficiently, and be able to recognize how to read, build alliances, associations, coalitions, and the like. And then also, not only is it local governance, and I'll go through this a little bit more in detail, in the past 2 months, we had the majority leader, the Republican majority leader, come to a local charter school and bring a whole host of Republicans with him, which is an unprecedented event. And so, not to be upstage, a sitting senator hosted a Senate hearing and invited a bunch of charter schools and publicity and folks to come and hear what he has to say about school reform. So school reform is every day getting closer and closer associated with the charter school and the charter school executive. And so the person running the school really has to keep their eye on the ball and how all of these elements interplay. So some significant factors that have happened. The DC Charter School Board announced that they will now fast-track authorization. They're having a policy because they're saying that they are having difficulty in finding charter school leaders, and this is all in the paper as well, that they cannot find charter school leaders that have a broad base of skill sets that speak to the need efficiently to run charter schools in the manner in which they see fit, and they're the authorizing agency. And then in combination, they're saying there's such an increase in demand for charter school access that they are doing things differently. Okay? The DC Deputy Mayor announced a significant priority initiative which will allow high-performing charter schools to find long-term leases, because occupancy and space for schools, for charter schools, is a real big challenge. So this is a huge commitment here. And and the DC Public Schools, they're just announced that they're, well, not just, but in May, June, they're closing more schools because of low enrollment. They have several schools that only occupancy is only up to 50% frequently, and then because of school performance. So charter schools are really attracting more and more and more students from the charter school traditional system. More significant factors, in 2008, Nelson Smith of the Public Alliance for Public Charter Schools called for a critical look at executive leadership, and then his successor, Ms. Wright, she added to that and called for succession planning. And we're going to go through that a little bit more in detail. And then Mayor Gray recently in May, June, introduced legislation that radically will definitely impact charter schools, both charter schools and public schools. And then we have a DC councilman, Catania, who introduced 6 major bills that will also impact charter schools. Now, his piece of legislation and his piece of legislation are not congruent. They will not be able to live and rest well. So it's pretty much a battleground. And so what do you do when elephants war? You get out of the way. Okay, so here's Eric Cantor, went to 2 Rivers Public Charter Schools, accompanied by Republican Leadership, House of Education and Workforce Committee. Ron Paul convened a hearing, and for the very first time, the DC Charter School Board and DC Public Schools are convening their first strategic talks. They've probably been talking behind the scenes for a long time because the ground beneath it is shifting. But now they're publicly talking because they both really need each other to survive. Now, how they're a bit different is that charter schools have a foundation in operating from an innovative standpoint, and public charter schools are their policies, their philosophy, their mantras are very, very traditional. So that's where they're going to have to figure out how they're going to work together and be able to survive. Okay. So here's the problem. It's not really known to what extent charter school leaders train, because this is what we're looking at, training, and how it relates to charter school leadership practice. It's not really known to what extent there is a relationship. Again, the issue of non-consensus on national standards, and there's limited scholarly research on this specific topic relating to training to practice, and there's limited availability of executive charter leadership training that people who would like to go into this specific role have access to. So here's some of the gaps in research. There's a whole host of research on training related to mentoring new school leaders, but it really speaks to more principles and not at the executive level. But there are a few scholarly examples of really strong research. Latham, Gross, Nato Stern, Bridgespan. These people come out of the Center for Reinventing Public Education, and they're doing quite a bit now because it's timely. It's very quite timely. Okay. So here's chapter 2, leadership. School leaders must build community, work collaboratively, empower others, and dig deep to create organizational change and manage that change. Okay, so charter schools as business, the focus is entrepreneurial and innovative. Sean saying concentration on the external drivers. That figure that I showed you that showed the internal and external drivers, which were politics, trends, technology, the community. Executives have to oversee independent operations, meaning that charter schools do not have the luxury of a district office as a back source or back room. So they have to do their own hiring, their own purchasing, their own advocacy, community advocacy. And they have to do everything as an independent operation. And that's why they have the ability to function, make decisions in the same way that a district can, because they're a lead educational agency. They're solely responsible for operational support, and they are required to be sustainable and be able to last over time. And here again, this slide is very much known for strategy, and Wright is the one that came up with the succession planning requirement on a national level. More about charter schools business. So business executives are very familiar with making the connection between their training and real world outcomes. So charter school leaders are clamoring currently to look for training that will help them in their charter school environment, managing that environment, because there's a really high turnover rate. A lot of charter school leaders last about, and I'm saying executive leaders, they last about maybe 3 to 4 years on average, and very often times by the time they get to that 3rd or 4th year, they're burned out because they're doing so much. Okay? And then there's some training gaps. meaning that about 75% of the leaders that come into charter schools in the executive role have not received any specific training for the role that they're assuming. And this came out of the same study of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. So without a national standard, rigorous research is required and looked for. And so these are some of the people that are trying to push the envelope to find funding for training and also ensure that once funding is available, that agencies or granting authorities are going to help them to ensure that the training gets to the people that need the training, the executives come in. Okay, so this is an example of what the National Charter School Alliance looks for in terms of a skill set for executive leader in charter schools. Strategic planning, experience working with the board, setting some measurable standards, team building, creating trust, and implementing the vision of the leader, advancement. This is all about fundraising and development, all about fundraising, because charter schools typically cannot survive on the budget, the public funding that comes to them. They have to look for multiple sources. Governance, working directly with the board chair, who the executive charter school leader always reports to, the board chair. So sometimes, depending on what the board composition is, this could be extremely challenging. It could be extremely challenging because sometimes charter school leaders can come into an organization where they haven't chosen their board members, they haven't groomed their board members, so they're coming in at the back end and working with board members. Sometimes I've seen some of the compositions of board members being heavily comprised of persons with legal background and not a whole lot of educational background or political background, what makes it a little bit challenging, like the kind of t-shirts we had, yes. External relations, the primary spokesperson for the school. Financial management, which, you know, the executive should have support in this area as well as this advancement fundraising. And then the oversight of the academic programming team, meaning that typically the school principal reports to the executive charter school leader. Okay, so these are some trends in current training. Harvard has a program, a 32-credit master's program for school leadership. This includes primarily principals, directed at principals. This one's a little bit different. California State, Dominguez Hills, a year-long cohort training for both principals and executives. And then this is also a different blending, a hybrid. Rice University School of Business, a 2-year master's program which combines business administration and education entrepreneurs, which is really, I think, the best blend for what executive charter school leaders do. And then these two persons, Lay, did quite a bit of research on rural. She's out in Iowa. So these are the pieces of skill sets that she found to be critical for that particular area. And then this is Jeffrey Canada out of Harlem in New York, and he looks at it a bit differently. He's looking at really getting to the heart of who you're going to select to support and implement your vision. He sees that as being the most critical piece, getting the right person. I'm having difficult conversations with the right person, and having a commitment to developing yourself, and then maintaining some sense of humility. Most people that I've looked at, I think this is probably the most unique set of skills that have emerged. She is in Colorado, and she's an authorizer for charter schools. And so she's looking at it from a much more broader standpoint. She's looking at vision and future, entrepreneurialism, which we see repeated, calculated risk. You're going to see this risk factor repeated over and over again. It kind of is a singular thread to take note of. Understanding internal structural relationships and building alliances both internally and externally. Values diversity motivates. Okay. Now, the reason I had this in all red, because Campbell, she interviewed about, I would say about 400 plus charter school leaders across the nation. And she is saying that from her conversations, evaluation, and self-reporting of executive charter school leaders, and she was primarily looking at the principals level, she is saying that school leaders, even if they earn a degree at an Ivy League principal preparation program, and then they go on to perform at the top of their class, the chances are that the leader still lacks important skills needed to manage a charter school efficiently. So, most of the charter school leaders come out of these types of programs, maybe not Ivy League all the time, but certainly development, training, and leadership programs that have a similar profile. And so what we're seeing is that the leaders are not necessarily prepared to the degree and able to handle or make the quick adjustments that they need to make in really working with the elements that they're forced to deal with. Okay, methodology. We got it. I like Howard Gardner. He's actually a psychologist and he's more known for multiple learning styles. Okay, so here are my 3 research questions. Are executive charter school leaders adequately prepared to exemplify the leadership practices in their role without having a training? Are they able to do the same thing with having a training? And does the current available leadership training prepare them for real-world complexities associated with the role that they're getting ready to take on? Here are my 2 hypothesis statements. No, there is no relationship. An alternative hypothesis, there is a relationship between exemplary leadership practices and charter school leaders. Okay. Now, I spoke about this a little bit earlier. Here's my framework. So I start here with the first way of looking at executive charter school leaders as the next generation. Where are they going to come from? How are they going to be trained? Because we're going to have a whole slew of executive leaders leaving the system because they're retiring. So what is next? How do we get them trained, the new ones trained properly and adequately prepared? Because it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of time for mentorship and succession planning if they're leaving. So here is when Wright came in 2012. This was Nelson Smith. This is Wright 4 years later. And the other element is that the environment is very fluid, and also very fluid because the people change that are in charge, creating policies, right? So the deputy mayor that I spoke about a little while ago, who is helping now charter schools to obtain long-term leases, he's gone, right? The OSSI, which is Office of State Superintendent of Education, she's gone. So there's a high turnover within the industry as well, which creates quite a bit of instability. So here, Wright, who in 2012, she brought in this succession plan, and she's also gone. But however, this very much dovetails with Collins's level 5 leadership. Collins speaks to creating organizations that are long-lasting and sustainable, and organizations that are developed into institutions, right? And so this is what both of these heads were trying to do. So you have that as the beginning framework, and then we look at effective charter school executive leadership, and then you have these research scholarly research items, or not items, but studies that support in many different facets that I'll speak about throughout. But so this is the theoretical framework in which I'm looking at, or I have looked at, in order to understand, and that's what the study is about, to understand the effectiveness and what it takes to become an effective charter school leader in the environment and the context that is current now. So the research design was focused on correlational aspects of the research specifically. Is there a correlation or is there not a correlation? Typically, a correlation means X causes Y or Y causes X, which is a causal relationship. And then there's another element of correlation relationship. X and Y is caused by a third variable, which could be Z, which is defined as spurious. However, in order to do this type of study, it requires much more time, right? And so that's why I did not go in this area, but this is very interesting because I would really like to look at how all of the political dynamics will really begin to play out. But for the purpose of this particular study, I'm looking at the relationship between training and leadership practices. Population sampling, charter school leaders, 57 in total, were able to meet the criteria. And the criteria for participation as an executive charter school leader, they have executive responsibilities, they report to the board of directors, and they have primary responsibility for budgeting. I did a pre-test member checking that provided for validity. So there were 3 charter school members that looked at the survey instrument, looked at it for understandability, whether it was very clear, and whether the questions really spoke to what they find themselves experiencing within the context of their working. The authorizing agencies sent out the survey link to all of the executive charter school leaders and the local charter school, the CS, if I can rapidly going past, CS stands for Charter School Association helped in communication to executive charter school leaders on the study, and also help them to understand what the value of the study could be and the need, helping them understand the need for more research in this area. Okay, so these are the statistical applications that I applied in looking at the data and how to evaluate it. Quambos alpha reliability statistic, which basically shows whether I have enough data to come out with a reliable basis for which to make a determination and evaluating the data that I'm sending. And also did a bivariate analysis using ANOVA statistic, which is the basic regression analysis, just looking at 2 variables, leadership practices and training. Additionally, did the Pearson correlation statistic, determining the strength between the strength of linear relationship between the variables, and they were also done on all 6 of the dependent variables and the leadership practices individually. That's we'll talk about that survey. Pearson chi-square statistic was applied to control for the degree of inconsistency, which I did find some significant inconsistency between a few variables. So we ran the Pearson chi to look at that, and then just the descriptive statistics. And that's really looking at the need for all of the variables. Okay, so here's our instrumentation that I used. I initially 2 years ago, I wrote to these authors. They're the authors, Kustis and Posner, and requested whether I could use their instrument. They responded back very favorably. And so we were able to move forward and use their instrument, which I'm very pleased that they responded favorably, because these instruments can be very expensive. And if you go the other direction and create your own instrument, it can be very costly. So time and cost is very much a factor that you try to limit as you're going through this. So Koussis and Posner have a very good track record. They have extensive research on leadership, covering over 25 years of investigation. The LPI is a 30-item behavioral questionnaire, and the self, meaning that it's a self-assessment, self-reporting. Reliability for the LPI is routinely tested through analysis of internal reliability, and all 5 leadership practices categories are shown to have very good internal reliability coefficients, and I'll show you a bit of that in a minute. Okay. The foundation for leadership practices inventory is grounded in transformational leadership theory, and these are the big guys in transformational leadership: McGregor, Northouse, Bass, Venice. Well, actually, it should be Ovello, because that was his partner. Always coming out with quite a bit of good studies and it shine. The nature of transformational leadership engages, connects, and raises the level of how people are motivated and respond to your leadership and are willing to go beyond just the basics of just getting things done, having things that are measurable, and also being accountable in their practice. So you are inspiring other persons as well as holding yourself accountable for meeting their needs, as well as always engaging in professional practice that will enhance your skills as well. So that's pretty much what the LPI is grounded in, the foundation. So these are the 5 core leadership competencies: challenging the process, which means going outside of the status quo, sharing, inspiring a shared vision, helping people to see where you want to go, how you're going to get them there, enabling others to act, fostering collaboration, building spirit in teams. And teamwork is the way that organizations are really, really encouraging leadership to go, to make sure that you're being effective and efficient, bringing together collaborative teams from each element of your organization, so that you have the richest value of innovation, ideas, and complexity as you're trying to solve really difficult problems. Modeling the way means that you're walking the walk. You're demonstrating how things should be done, and you're demonstrating it with high standards. Encouraging the heart, meaning recognizing and celebrating accomplishments of others regularly. Okay, so scholarly research has been done using the Leadership Practices Inventory instrument. I looked at these studies as most significant to mine because they're looking at superintendents, and that's the closest to the executive charter school leader, very differently from the university president or the principal of schools. So this is more about the statement of reliability. The most important is that when this instrument is used, the reliability is very high, because when you do the test and when you come back, say a colleague does a retest, you're really going to be able to see very similar integrity, very similar results, which shows that it has very high reliability. And then also what's very significant is face validity. Do the results make sense to people? And that's also associated with the member checking that I did prior to starting my research. Okay, so this is also just saying that other people who have also done the implemented ET survey, the LPI reliability scores, and generally you really want to see if your reliability falls within 0.8 up to and higher. This is a little low, but they also work, that was for principals, so that wasn't so much of a concern for me. Okay, so assumptions and limitations. We're assuming that given the fluid charter school environment, leaders will also be impacted by the political variables, the climate, particularly board engagement, depending on what the composition of the board is, the school culture, whether they have enough funding to actually implement their goals and the vision. And facilities can be a huge problem for effective charter school leaders because it's just incredible the amount of money, and then they have to go into bond issues, so you really need a good financial person. And so there are lots of things in the environment that are very impactful. Performance outcomes for charter practices alone cannot offer a specific diagnostic prescription for how to fix all the elements. Everything, and you go back to the original figure that I showed you that showed the internal and the external. All of that is interplaying at the same time. So just the practices alone do not tell the whole picture. And so some of the limitations of the study only focuses on executive charter school training. We're only looking at charter schools generically as a whole. We're not segmenting and looking at lower schools, middle schools, or high schools, or technical schools, and then also an adult school. So we're looking at charter schools generically. I'm only looking at Washington, D.C., and I've only covered a period of 2 years. Now this 2003 showed extraordinary rapid change in the environment. So I was really working very hard to get all of this data so I could take a look, because I think if I would have continued studying this by maybe October or November, I would have much more to look at that would change the whole complexion. So I was glad to move on with it. And I was glad that people were helping it and being very open and transparent in the process. So correlation, not causation, is a measure of how closely related two things are: leadership training and practices. Okay, so let's look at the response rate that I received. So the instrument was delivered to 57 executive charter school leaders. 40 responded. 5 of the 40 that responded exited the survey prior to completing all of the questions, leaving only 35 completed surveys. And that constituted 65% response rate. Okay? So Alec and Settle say that 50 to 70% is pretty much an average for an electronic survey response. So I wasn't too disappointed with that response rate. So of the missing 17 responses, this tells you quite a bit of what's going on with charter schools in D.C. Executives left midway through the school year, and there was just a person temporarily there taking care of operational and compliance issues. The executive left, and there's no one there that they filled the position with. And so it was the board that took on responsibility, and I wasn't looking at board experience. 2 schools opened and contracted with an executive who was already working within the system and already assigned to a school. And so since I had that executive, I couldn't count him twice. So that lowered my numbers as well. And then 4 charter school organizations refused to participate, again, because they do have the right to refuse because they are their own lead education agency. And that was fine. Reliability, my test results for Cronbach reliability test resulted in a score of 0.84, which was an acceptable range, and is also listed from Kousas and Pauser and what they view as an acceptable range. And other sources that have done research, like the University of Georgia, have come back with a similar range. So more results. The bivariate analysis I used using the ANOVA statistic calculated that I had a very high F statistic of 71.058, which is very high, which typically indicates that I have a high significant range. And so how this works out is that this F statistic says that there was a high significance, and the high significance is because it was lower than 0.05, and the reliability of 6.683. Okay. Pearson correlation statistic also showed a high statistic here, high significance value of at least a 0.05 or 0.01. So if these numbers here in terms of a significance level are higher than this, that means that there's no real significant correlation. And so I would have to start looking at other ways to interpret the data, but it was just very clear that there was a significance. And then the Pearson chi-square statistic showed a significant level of lower than 0.05. And remember, this is the one that I wanted to see how I could look at the great variation I was seeing between several of the variables. So I was very glad to see that, because sometimes we see a lot of variation, you're trying to figure out why. So this helped me to understand that what I was seeing was true and reliable, and helping me to determine whether I would actually accept or reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so here's my question one. Again, are these leaders doing well without training? Participants who did not receive training showed similar leadership practices in 4 of the 5 leadership practice practices. Challenging the process was one of the areas that the participants without training showed a significant difference in pattern, meaning that they performed much lower when it came time to demonstrate their skill in challenging the process, challenging the status quo. They only came up as high as a 48th percentile, and Kousas and Pauser indicate that 70th percentile is really when you start showing a high performance in leadership practice. And how did our leaders do who did have training? The results show that there was a correlation between training and leadership practice for this group, because everyone in that group showed at least a 70th percentile performance rating. And then 3, does the available leadership training adequately prepare for real-world complexities? Well, out of all of the participants, only 25% of all participants actually had training, because going back, if you remember, the National Alliance said that 75% of these people are coming into the schools without the adequate training. So I was amazed at how these numbers really fell out for me. So only 25% came in. So it's really a little bit difficult to really show a very clear, real hard figure whether they were all adequately prepared. But they did show that they were able to respond in a high percentage range. So it allowed us to do some really good and clear comparison between the 2 groups who had training and who did not have training. Okay, so here's a combined score for looking at how people hand out and encouraging the heart, modeling practices, enabling people to meet goals, and showing vision, articulating the vision, being able to communicate the vision, and challenge. This is the area that I really started looking at quite a bit, and I'll show you in the next slide, challenging the process. Okay, as you can see, the lighter color are people who had training, and darker color are participants who did not have training. So there's a pretty interesting, significant difference here in terms of encouraging the heart. These three are pretty much negligible. But here is where you really start to see the variance between practice. So the people who did not have training are really showing limited scope and performance in this particular area in challenging the process, while people who did have training are showing that they're responding in ways that challenge the process and take risks and work outside of the boundaries and look for ways, innovative ways to get things done in more significant numbers than folks who did not. Now, this really jumps out at you because this speaks to risk-taking behavior by participant training status. So, well, let's just read it from left to right. Participated in training and took risk, 92%. Participated in training and did not take risk, only 8% of the folks who did take training did not really take much risk, right? So the majority of this group that participated in training prior to coming into their position, the majority, 92%, always pretty much took risk. And risk taking when the outcome was not specifically guaranteed or they couldn't predict the outcome. So that was the question, will you take a risk when the outcome is not guaranteed? So that's what they're responding to. And then conversely, 87% of the participants in training that did not take risks and did not participate in training, this is where they were. They did not take risks, and they also did not participate in training, and then only 13% took risks who did not participate in training. So that's a huge, huge gulf, huge gap there. So issues related to risk-taking behavior. Many of these executive charter school leaders have witnessed their peers in a fairly protracted experience, and which involved public scrutiny of their professional character because they did take calculated risks, but those risks did not yield the best intended results that they had hoped. And when I'm saying a fairly protracted and public scrutiny, I'm talking about when you make decisions as an organizational leader and you are written about for days upon days, and you're on the front of the Washington Post. That's pretty public. Okay, so these are some headlines just written from the Washington Post. Teachers in 18 DC classrooms cheat on tests last year, pro fines. Charter school leader connected to cheating, scandal resigns. DC wants experienced charter operators in a hurry. So the underlying statement here is that DC is questioning the quality, and sometimes the ethical standards, or the ability to market and put your brand out there so that people can recognize what your particular brand is, so that your brand is recognizable and your name is your brand. Embattled charter school leader resigns and lives with board. Now this was a very difficult one here because the woman that they're referring to, she started the school, raised a ton of money for the school. The school expanded, opened up 3 other campuses, but politically there was a call for a different direction. She held true to her direction because she's a founder, but the board had other ideas, and since she reported to the board, even though she was a founder, she was pretty much outed or ousted or run over, more or less. Okay, Talent asserts that executives must show accountability and demonstrate skill in how they make decisions, which should include balanced measure of data, evaluation, and gut and sheer instinct. Potential risk-taking behavior could be if you're changing a policy that increases accountability and requires measurable outcomes, committed strategic alliances with external bodies, because who you align yourself with also reflects upon what your organizational vision or perception of your organization is. And so you have to be very clear and careful with who you're aligning with, incorporating innovation change in a status quo environment. So that goes back a little bit to charter schools meeting and having to work with the established entities, and commitment to long-range development plans. Sometimes these long-range development plans can really saddle you. So you have to be very clear and do a lot of research, a lot of homework, a lot of planning, a lot of strategy development before you commit to a long-range. And when I'm saying development, this means like a capital campaign or funding strategy that takes place over the course of maybe 5 to 10 years. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so I rejected the null hypothesis. Okay, why? Because 5 statistical applications were applied: the descriptive statistics, the t-test, the ANOVA, the Pearson correlation, the Pearson chi-square. Wave your hand if I'm killing you. Okay. Each application produces a statistically significant result of a significance less than 0.05%. And accordingly, the alternative hypothesis was accepted, and that there is a relationship between training and leadership practice. So in accepting the alternative hypothesis, which is this, the data was also accepted as evidence against the mean, and the mean was accepted as being of a true, valuable, reliable data and value. Chapter 4 summary, that's really just a lot of the same thing. These guys make me be very, very detailed, so don't be mad at me. I'm just being true to how they taught me. More summary. Okay, so this is actually a pretty good one. There was a strong corollary relationship between participants who did participate in leadership training and who were willing to take risks when there was a chance of failure, as well as participants who did receive training were willing to search outside of formal boundaries for innovative ways to improve upon their goals and achievements from the prior quarter or year. So these people really seem, who did receive some of the training, they did seem to be a little bit ahead of the curve in their contemporaries who did not. Those who did not participate in leadership training were less likely to take risks and much more or less likely to search outside of formal boundaries. And one of the reasons here is because in this context of this charter school environment, there's such heavy pressure for schools to produce academic achievement, change the student profile, you heard of turnaround. So there's all of this heavy pressure. So oftentimes there's a lack of trust, they're tunnel vision and focus on the academic and not looking at the environment in which they are all living and working and breathing. So the LPI survey was online, anonymous data collection process. Chapter 5. We talked about this, very fluid, rapid structural change, policy changes. I just don't want to be too repetitious here. Change management is paramount skill. So implications of the data, the results show less risk taking where outcomes might lead to failure as well as less liability. So it's plausible to speculate that executive charter school leaders who have not had training may not have been exposed to skill building related to assessing their industry. And Porter speaks about this quite a bit in terms of the five elements, looking at your competitors, looking at environment, looking at suppliers and such. And all of these business theoretical perspectives can be translated into the charter school environment. But DC is in a unique position in terms of the historical context. Number one, because of the political aspects that we talked about, DC is ranked number 2 annually in terms of local market share, and they have a tremendous wait list. So that all gives DC opportunity, DC Executive Charter School leverage in how to work within the system. They probably just need a little, maybe some mentoring, training, as we've been talking about. Drivers that impact the internal environment are compelling agents that influence the demand for innovative change. And back to Collins again, level 5 leadership suggests that executives possess the ability to establish long, sustaining institutions. Most challenging elements for charter schools: attrition, vision alignment, internal culture, student achievement. Engaging parents is key because they're a key critical piece, and they could speak to different audiences for you, and sometimes where executive cannot. We talked about facilities. Rising cost of health care and pension plans is a significant monster that charter schools have to prepare and plan for. The use of technology. Some schools are looking at increasing the use of technology and having blended learning, where some students, high school students primarily, will come to school 3 days a week, and the other 2 days they go to hubs where they have self-paced learning, and so that cuts down on some of the costs, the personnel costs. And then there's growing competition, and charter schools are actually on the precipice for dramatic policy changes for the next 4 to 6 years, clearly. More about political environment. Lake talks about current school governance being hostile to innovation, which we talked about a little bit. And Heifetz and Minsky, as well as Alan Mulally, the CEO of Ford, he also speaks to making sure that you bring the ideas closer to the people that you need to implement your vision. So he did a lot of, he came from aerospace industry. He did a lot of walking around, talking to people, knowing their names, knowing their children's names. And And by doing that, he changed the culture. He was able to change the way in which people committed to their role and task. And so getting the decision making closer to people who can help implement your vision, as well as give you feedback on how to solve some of these problems, and do it in a way that's authentic, not just lip service. So recommendations, opportune time for a thorough internal and external environmental analysis. Strategy begins with an environmental scan, looking at data and making informed, cogent decision-making processes and making it clear and transparent, and so that more people are engaged and participating in their decision-making process. So these are just some examples of other strategies that are out there that charter school leaders could draw upon. Mintzberg, he has an overview, he calls it Strategy Safari. And all of these are different strategic applications of strategic approaches to how you're going to position yourself in the industry. Are you going to look at planning, patterning, perspective? And it really goes along with aligning with the leader's personality and how they view the world. And then you have my guy, Michael Porter, Competitive 5 Forces. And all of these elements can be transposed, implemented by a charter school executive and their board. So I came up with the thought that since there's so much in the political arena that's going on that's impacting charter schools, their operations, that they need to come up with a political development strategy that focuses on all key players. And if they don't have the resources sometimes, or if they do have resources and not the time, then they need to find one of these public resource agencies that can work with nonprofits that can help them in developing these areas that they may not be proficient in or don't have the manpower or the time. So developing a political strategy, I'm suggesting for them to take a look at the key players in the political field and how they vote. That's critical. Understanding how people vote on issues pertaining to charter schools. Take a look at the speeches that these public figures make and analyze their speeches and look at what they say about reform in charters. Look at membership organizations and political action committees that they sit on. Review legislation associated with the key players' names regarding charter schools. Do an assessment of their political strength. Now this is real hard-hitting stuff requiring some degree and level of expertise where they may need to have outside consultants come in and help them with that. They also need to look at what are the pros and cons of aligning with one particular political camp or individual. How can their organization best deliver their own case study or story, as I talked about in terms of delivering their brand? And who are the strongest opponents to you as a charter leader? And how do you convert those opponents and make them your allies? Now, this would be very helpful as a beginning, and then looking at some of the other business strategies that were recommended. Implementation of this research study. I would suggest a mixed methods approach if someone wanted to come back and do this particular study because my study gave interesting data, but I don't know why. I don't know why the charter school executive leaders chose to respond to the data. So by doing a mixed method, you could have interviews, you could have open-ended questions, and it answers some of those questions about why. So I would think that a mixed method might be a better approach. And also, if a person is very interested in using the LPI self, I would suggest use self as well as LPI 360, so you can get other feedback from colleagues, subordinates, community members, depending on their role, as well as other persons that are able to observe the participant in their role. They give you a different reflective look. Areas for future research, there are quite a few, which I was glad because this study really had me thinking. So, what is the impact on student performance, styles of the executive leader, implication for the role of the board, local and national politics, effectiveness of charter school authorizers and how their effectiveness impacts the ability of the executive charter school leader to be proactive, charter school autonomy and how the charter school executive is able to leverage their power, and the evolution of charter school executive leadership. So those were just 7. I did have more, but I know that you guys will be looking at me. And so I'm wrapping it up. See, and that's it. Okay.
Okay, so it's your turn next.
I was about to start. First, I wanted one of the main features of your study that just I think was enlightening for me or insightful for me is the fact that you were looking at leadership in education, and then that you recognized how, from a business perspective, business processes or approaches to business work, right? How the blending of those, in particular with using or recognizing Porter's 5 forces model as an avenue or an approach for charter schools. I had not thought about that. I mean, think about business and charter schools as businesses, but using that model, because we use that with Walmart's, business as business, but looking at a charter school as a business, which I've always thought in terms of charter schools as businesses as well. So I like that.
Okay.
And Porter's model is, I love that model for business, but
It's simplistic.
yes, but the overlay for charter schools is really good. I have a couple questions with respect to your sample size of your population that you use for the surveys. Were all of those positions identified specifically as executive
Yes.
directors? So there weren't any?
So some of executive leadership. Some are executive director, some are called head of school, some are called superintendent.
Right.
So they all have the executive leadership responsibility.
But none of them were
Might have-
principals?
None were principals.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And of those who had taken training, was the source of that training?
No,
Okay.
I don't know where they
Okay,
take.
so there was
Right.
no indication as to whether or not any of them had been in, you mentioned the entrepreneurship.
Well, I did ask what type of training, whether it was a summer academy or whether it was a year-long.
Of the program in education entrepreneurship. Did you look at all at what is involved in that program? And how did they?
Yes,
you said
I've called all of these people around the country several times, and I was not getting much feedback because I don't think they have enough data, whether they're able to tell me whether these programs have been successful, because they just started maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So people are being placed into or accepting roles as executive charter school leaders. So they haven't been in their positions long enough in order to ascertain whether they could look back on the program and determine their success or not.
Were you able to ascertain how those programs were, or what was the research or the approach in developing those programs, and what kinds of things? Because the whole idea of education entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurship from the standpoint of the secondary, elementary, higher ed, the whole idea of education entrepreneurship. Did you look at all?
Well,
how those,
what they were saying, and that's the Rice University one, right?
I think
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's Rice. How they market their program. Can you guys hear her questions?
yes.
Okay. How they marketed their program is they wanted not to ground their leaders in academic principles of learning, but to expand beyond the classroom and look more globally at how to sustain the organization. They do want them to have some ability to be able to supervise principals and supervise the academic process, but they wanted them to know about finance, they wanted them to know about management, they wanted them to have much more political acumen and comfort level in dealing with audiences outside of the school setting, in the environment. So that's how they are marketing the program.
As you know, I try not to
Be
give
verbose.
give you more tasks in this process. This process is going on for some time, and we've been stretching you quite a bit. One of the things that I was glad to see that you took the opportunity to explain what risks were, because that was an issue initially, as you mentioned, risks throughout the presentation. The other thing that, or one thing that I think needs some further, I don't mean to use the technical, further explanation is that relationship between principal and executive leader. I don't mean in terms of the charter school, but you mentioned it at the beginning, and sort of the assumption is that everyone knows that a principal doesn't have to do all of these things that you have with the executive leader. But a principal does have to have a budget for his or her school. A principal does have to do certain things within the context of a superintendent district or what have you. So maybe a paragraph or so explaining that the principal's role is less in that it doesn't do those, not even a paragraph, a sentence, in that it doesn't do those things. That's one. The other thing that I was struck by is, as you know, I've been dealing with this thing all with you. The responsibility for a national standard. I mean, that's the big thing now, a common core. And whether in fact we as a nation are moving to where a national standard, whoever sets that standard and how it's set. And if I'm an executive with a board that has certain responsibilities, vision, and what have you, what's my relationship to the national standard? What should my relationship be to a national standard? Should I be concerned about a national standard?
Well,
I mean,
clearly they're not.
Well,
And they're
yeah,
pushing back.
But that's the kind of,
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing that I think a little bit about that, since you mentioned the national standard piece would be necessary. And I said
And that's where a qualitative study would come in, and I could ask some of those open-ended questions to get a deeper
Yeah.
response.
And I don't know if there was a concern by some, but there may have been an implication that the executive leader could have a different vision than the board, and that used to clear it up with the point of the woman who founded the
Yeah,
charter school
right.
and being anything, but being clear about what the vision and having the board to accept that vision of the executive leader, or vice versa. The board has a vision.
Well,
and
in that situation, she was very, very effective at building alliances and fundraising and building a good reputation where funders trusted the outcomes of what she was going to be able to deliver for the school. But the board felt very strongly that it was not the school's responsibility to do any level of fundraising. It was a responsibility of the public domain because they received public funding for the school, which is a total disconnect. Total disconnect.
And that might lead, I think, in many charter schools towards the problem.
Yeah.
Because if they're expecting and depending on the public schools, which I know we didn't go into that here, but if they're expecting funding from the public schools, whatever they go and do on their own, I just want to thank you very much. I did know a lot about charter schools, but I learned a lot more about charter schools.
Through the 75 slides.
In following this. So I want to thank you.
Okay.
And I just have one quick. Early on, we talked about these management organizations that are now quite popular with charter school, and for the branding, if you will, of a charter
There's
school.
KIP.
Yeah, all those.
Yeah.
So on your diagram where you indicate all these things that the executive leader has to. Yeah, I know we talked about it early on, but I don't remember seeing it in that type entity.
I really probably just listed that as competitors.
Okay, great. You look.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, all right. Okay, good.
Okay, any, that's it?
That's it.
Okay, well, then we'll go next door and we'll be back in a few, so.
We'll be waiting.
Can we offer cake and fruit and whatever while we're waiting, or no? Yeah, I sort of did already. Maybe, right? Get back to
Yeah, okay. I'll get back on the
So what time do we have?
Wait a minute, you have to wait here.
We gotta get
pictures on it.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
All right.
Now, we're gonna all gather and go downstairs. We have a 2 o'clock sitting at Piola downstairs, and my son is in tears. So, get a little bit.
Do we need pictures of your family?
Yeah. Okay, let me put this stuff down.
Wait, let me get it for you. Put it down, please.
Cassandra Banks Levine. Will the Doctorate of Education and Organizational Leadership degree graduate please come forward